Hello and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1967 classic, The Dirty Dozen. A bit of a renegade officer named Reisman is assigned to select and train 12 hardened criminals in the U.S. Army for what amounts to a suicide mission. Reisman is to take these criminals and turn them into special operatives that will parachute behind German lines just before the D-Day landings in order to assassinate several high-ranking German officers who are known to be essentially partying at a French chateau. Film follows Reisman and his men as they train and navigate the Army's continued attempts to derail the plan and send the men back to prison. Reisman and his Dirty Dozen successfully pass through training and execute their mission. Dirty Dozen stars Lee Marvin as Major Reisman, Jim Brown as Jefferson, Donald Sutherland as Pinkley, Charles Bronson as Waterslaw, Telly Savalas as Maggot, Ernest Borgnine, John Cassavetes, Richard Jekyll, George Kennedy, and Robert Ryan. Dirty Dozen was directed by Robert Aldrich, produced by Kenneth Hyman, and based on the book of the same name written by E. M. Nathanson. The film was a massive success, both financially and critically. There's something about covert operations, special missions, and the like always seem to capture the imagination. Even people who don't necessarily consider themselves World War II aficionados or experts seem to be captivated by the idea of a special mission, something behind enemy lines. I guess it's the dark of night, danger lurking at every corner type of thing that grabs people's attention and holds it. And it's hard not to like those types of stories. Lord knows Hollywood has made plenty of them. Many movies have been made centering on the so-called special mission. We dove into the Dirty Dozen at length in the main episode, and we mentioned a few other movies of the same ilk, Where Eagles Dare being one of many. And while the vast majority of Hollywood's special mission movies are works of pure fiction, like the Dirty Dozen, there were a great many actual behind-the-lines covert ops that were performed in World War II. Some of them were huge successes, and some were abject failures. I thought it'd be kind of cool to dive into a few of the actual special missions on this particular episode. One of the more famous covert ops of the war involved a corpse. Well, honestly, most covert ops in the war at least resulted in a corpse, or two, or many. This one began with a corpse. Operation Mincemeat, aptly named, was an intelligence mission planned and executed to fool the Germans into thinking that the Allies would land in Greece, as opposed to Sicily, following the Allies' victory in North Africa. A homeless man from the United Kingdom named Glender Michael, who'd committed suicide via rat poison, was chosen to perform this mission. That's correct, I didn't misspeak. A dead man was chosen to perform this mission. British intelligence had gotten hold of the corpse and created a false identity for the man. Michael became Major William Martin, for whom the Brits spent months creating a plausible and intricate backstory. Michael, now Martin's, pockets were stuffed with personal items, ID card, theater tickets, letters from his fiancée, and other personal effects. To his wrist was chained a briefcase, in which supposedly top-secret documents were contained therein. These documents identified Greece as the target for the next Allied invasion in the effort to defeat Nazi Germany. Martin's corpse was stowed aboard a British submarine and jettisoned off the coast of Spain, where a few days later he washed ashore, complete with uniform, personal items, and briefcase. Spain was full of Nazi spies, despite it being a neutral country, and therefore Martin's appearance as a dead Royal Marine intelligence courier who had seemingly been killed in an airplane crash, attracted every German spy within earshot. After about a week, the German spies in Spain had wormed their way in to be able to see the briefcase's documents. Photos of the falsified documents made it all the way to the Führer himself. Hitler and his intel people were fooled, took the bait, so to speak. The Germans moved entire divisions out of Sicily and placed them in Sardinia and Greece for an invasion that never came. After the war, one of the planners of the missions wrote a book about it, and in turn, Hollywood made a movie about the book called The Man That Never Was. Good flick, too. Oh, and one more thing. If the story sounds like something out of a James Bond movie, there's good reason for it. The original creator of Operation Mincemeat was a Brit named Ian Fleming, the same Ian Fleming who introduced the world to Agent 007. As I've said before, truth is stranger than fiction. Another important covert operation was one that took place in Norway called Operation Gunnerside. This was an operation undertaken by Norwegians who were in exile in Great Britain. 9 Norwegians infiltrated German lines on the night of February 27, 1943. Their mission? To destroy water pipes in a hydroelectric plant. Big deal, right? Well, big deal indeed. This particular hydroelectric plant, the Norsk hydroelectric plant, was the sole producer of what is called heavy water. What is heavy water? Well, I'll let Neil Bascom, the author, tell you, and I'll read his words. He says, and I quote, "Hydrogen has a single proton and a single electron, which is an isotope of hydrogen, has a neutron in its nucleus. This makes it heavier. It is very rare. There is 1 part heavy water for every 41 million molecules of regular water, and it has this ability as a so-called moderator. In an atomic reaction, it slows down bombarding neutrons and doesn't absorb them, which fosters a chain reaction." Germany threw all of their nuclear eggs into this one basket. The Norsk plant could produce massive amounts of electricity needed to make the heavy water. By destroying the pipes in the plant, the heavy water production would halt, thereby delaying or possibly destroying Germany's plans or ability to produce a nuclear weapon. The plan was hatched by a Norwegian scientist, Leif Tronstad, who fought the Germans in 1940, stayed in Norway, acted as a spy, left his family and fled to England only to infiltrate back into his country to destroy the heavy water plant he helped design. Knowing that bombing the plant would not harm the pipes deep in the plant's basement, infiltration and detonation were the only means with which to take the plant out. The Norwegians were led by a man named Joachim Ronenberg. Ronenberg and his group of commandos parachuted into Norway on the 16th of February. 5 days later, Ronenberg's group met with a previous group of Norwegians who'd been dropped in-country to acquire intel on the plant. The group approached the plant, crossing the bottom of a gorge, across a frozen river, and up a 500-foot cliff. The group cut a wire fence and entered the plant area. After getting through the fence, the group divided into their 4-man explosives group and 5-man cover squad. The explosives group planned to enter the plant through a side door. This door, however, was locked, as it were. Ronenberg was able to find an access tunnel and entered the plant. Once in the building, Ronenberg and his men placed 2 strings of explosive charges next to the heavy water production cells. In order to provide enough time to escape but still hear the explosion, he decided to shorten the fuse so they lasted only 30 seconds rather than the designed 2 minutes. The explosion apparently was not as loud as expected, but nonetheless, Ronenberg heard it and knew the mission was a success. After fleeing the plant and reconnecting with their cover squad, Ronenberg and the rest of the gunnerside group began to ski towards Ryukin. Once they reached the mountain plateau, groups split up. In uniform and fully armed, the explosives team traveled more than 200 miles to Sweden on skis. The cover group, on the other hand, spread out through the plateau. Despite the German search and pursuit of the group, none of the members were killed or captured. The plant was put out of commission for 5 months and then resumed activity. It was bombed by the U.S. 8th Air Force in November 1943 and minimally damaged. Aware that attacks would continue, the Germans decided to move their heavy water plant elsewhere, and at the same time their supply of heavy water with it. Led by Knut Højklid, a group of Norwegian saboteurs was ordered to sink a ferry carrying the Germans' semi-finished heavy water products to research centers in Germany. On February 20th, 1944, the, quote, hydro ferry, unquote, was sunk by an explosion in the boat's bow, and the Germans lost their last supplies of heavy water from the Vermark Norsk hydro plant. There were 4 German and 14 Norwegian casualties from the explosion. Hollywood made a movie about that particular operation, too. This one was called The Heroes of Telemark, a rather forgettable film, but a fascinating story. One last covert op I'll talk about was not an Allied operation, but a German one. It was called Unternehmen Greif, Operation Greif. German commandos, recruited and trained by Waffen-SS officer and renowned Commando Otto Skorzeny, were to drop behind American lines during the opening stages of the Battle of the Bulge. These specially trained men were to reroute traffic, cut communication lines, capture bridges, and destroy fuel dumps, as well as cause massive confusion. The confusion caused by the would-be saboteurs was so great that American soldiers began to see spies and saboteurs behind every tree. GIs didn't trust other GIs, detaining them and quizzing them by asking them questions only an American would know, like baseball scores, who's who, and the like. Ultimately, the plan succeeded in causing confusion, but that's about it. No bridges were captured, and the saboteurs did not heavily contribute to anything but wild rumors. Several of the Germans were captured, all wearing American uniforms, and all of them were executed as spies by the United States Army after a very brief trial. After the war, Otto Skorzeny was tried as a war criminal at the Dachau trials in 1947 for allegedly violating the laws of war during the Battle of the Bulge. He and 9 officers of Panzer Brigade 150 were charged with improperly using American uniforms by, quote, entering into combat disguised therewith and treacherously firing upon and killing members of the armed forces of the United States, unquote. They were also charged with participation in wrongfully obtaining U.S. uniforms and Red Cross parcels consigned to American prisoners of war from a prisoner of war camp. Acquitting all defendants, the military tribunal drew a distinction between using enemy uniforms during combat and for other purposes, including deception. It could not be shown that Skorzeny had actually given any orders to fight in U.S. uniforms. Skorzeny said that he was told by German legal experts that as long as he didn't order his men to fight in combat while wearing U.S. uniforms, such a tactic was a legitimate ruse of war. Skorzeny escaped from an internment camp in 1948, hiding out on a Bavarian farm for 18 months. Then he spent time in Paris and Salzburg before eventually settling in Spain. He died in 1975 of lung cancer. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next week when we discuss the 2015 Danish war film entitled April 9th. Until then, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and Music Shed Studios here in New Orleans. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.